thereof. We know, Lord, that we should be able to learn from these mistakes and from these things of the past, that we would look to Thee and to Thy soon coming, that we would learn that sin is the way of death and hell, and that in Thee is life. I pray that Thou wouldst rebuke every unclean spirit that would hinder our efforts tonight, and that everything that would be done here would be done to the glory of Thy name and of Thy kingdom. We ask it now in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, I'm going to start out by reading a few scripture verses, and I want to go into Revelation chapter 13 for just a minute. A couple of verses here. Something to think about as we study World War II. And if you recall, when I was talking about World War II, there was a World War I, which should have taught the world, war is terrible, let this never happen again. And it did happen again because there were some very evil people that wanted another world war. And they used men like Hitler and Mussolini and Hirohito and some of these others. They used these men to bring about their evil designs in trying to produce a one-world government. Every effort, remember this as you study history, the devil has always wanted that. From the days of ancient Babylon, from the days of ancient Egypt, really, all those empires that would arise and would fall, it was always the devil's effort to have one world government so that he could step in and seize upon the whole creation, which God had given over the dominion of to man. Okay? See, the devil knows he can't seize anything away from God. But because the dominion of this world was given to man, he feels like he can seize upon that man will relinquish his dominion and give it over to the devil. Well, that's never completely happened. To a great extent it has, but never completely. And never will. You know why? Because all the heavens and the earth and all the creation belongs to God. Amen. And the Lord is in control. He will not allow some things to happen. Now, we're going to look at Revelation 13 because ultimately, one world government was the goal. No matter how many people had to die, how many nations had to be war-torn, and how much heartache and sorrow would be brought about, it didn't matter to these people. Whatever it would take, people would have to be so horrified that they would give up their freedoms in favor of a one-world system, a dictatorship eventually. Now, if we look at history, and we have for weeks and weeks now, we know that dictatorships do not work. Okay? There is one God, there is one king, and we serve him. As far as human government goes, if you think about it, none of them have really worked well. Some have worked better than others. We're not going to study political science. We could talk about monarchies. Well, let me ask you, can somebody name a couple of different kinds of governments? I just said one, monarchies. What's another one? A democracy? Oh, that's a terrible one. A republic? Yeah, that's a much better one. Okay, an oligarchy. We know what all these things mean, don't we? What was one that ruled Rome for a while? How about a triumvirate? Okay, let's look at it this way. You have, in a monarchy, you have a rulership by one, don't you? It's one man. He's the king, controls everything. And of course, you have a conditional monarchy, or a limited monarchy, such as in England, where the Magna Carta, when it was signed in 1215, remember, right after lunch, when that was signed, that limited the monarchy. Then you have rule by three. We have examples of that, triumvirate. Rule by a few, an oligarchy. And then you have democracy, which comes from two Greek words, which means the people rule, majority of the people rule. Whatever the majority wants, everybody has to go along with. That's a terrible form of government. And then you've got a republic where, now a true republic is where, we didn't say anything about socialism and communism, but a true republic is where every individual is protected from every other individual. That's why it's the best. Just to look at the difference between a republic and a democracy. And we have had both in this country. Remember what Abraham Lincoln said this country was? He said it was a republic. You hear politicians talk about how this is a great republic, but then they turn right around and call it a democracy. You can't have both. Now, the communists like to use the word republic too, such as the People's Republic of China or the People's Republic of Massachusetts. Things like that. But anyway, see, they like to use that too. People's Republic of Wisconsin. That's a dandy. Yeah. But the difference is, let's say, just with all of us here, let's just say that Shelley's got $100 here, okay? I don't know if she does or not. Let's just say she's got $100. Now, I think, okay, I'll be a politician. I think that we should take that $100 that she's got and divide it up. Wouldn't you all like to have an equal share of their $100? All in favor, say aye. See? We all would. And she'd have to give it up. That's a democracy. Isn't that sweet? But in a republic, she would say, hey, that is my $100. Keep your clammy mitts off from it. You can't touch it. I can't take yours. You can't take mine. I am protected as an individual from all other individuals. That's the way this country was founded, as a republic. And the soldiers in the trenches in World War I, remember we're studying about that over in France? When they got the news, the news that Woodrow Wilson made the statement when the war was ended, and they were still in the trenches, they just got word, Woodrow Wilson made the statement that now this was a great victory for democracy. And you know what the soldiers said they were smart, they knew what it meant. Back in 1918, one of them was heard to say, my God, we've lost our country. You don't hear talk like that now, do you? People think democracy, wonderful. But people knew what it meant back then. If it was no longer a republic and now was a democracy, all was lost as a country. And I've got an excerpt somewhere from the United States Army Manual in 1914. And in the back, it defines certain terms, and it defines democracy as the worst form. This is the United States Army. The worst form of government always leads to anarchy. The government published that in 1914. But you just don't hear that kind of language anymore, do you? Well, anyway, the goal of the conspirators was always one world government. And if you read in Revelation chapter 13, it talks about the great beast that would rise up, and we dealt with that to a certain extent. But let's notice something here. Just a couple of verses in particular. Revelation 13:1. And I stood upon the sand of the sea and saw a beast rise up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns. And upon his horns 10 crowns, and upon his heads the name of blasphemy. Here you have a conglomerate government. All right, a composite. You know what a composite is? It's a mixture. Okay, it's something that will accommodate many things and entails many things. And the beast which I saw was like unto a leopard, and his feet were as the feet of a bear, and his mouth as the mouth of a lion. And the dragon gave him his power and his seat and great authority. Now, who's the dragon? It's the devil, isn't it? Yes, that's right. And if the devil gave this government, this composite government, this one world government, or would be one world government, his seat, his power, and great authority, then it's a satanic thing that we want nothing to do with. And yet we're in this world even though we're not of it. Therefore, we don't want to think like the beast. We don't want to talk or walk or act like the beast. We don't even want to be entertained by the beast, do we? We don't want anything to do with the beast, because the beast is of Satan. And God has warned us that the mark of this beast involves a number, 666. We understand that, don't we? Everything you buy at the store, everything that's marked with a uniform product code, has the mark of the beast already in it. Those vertical lines, you know what I'm talking about, with the numbers underneath. You'll notice that if you ever look at one, pick anything you want, any full code. Now they have abbreviated codes where this doesn't hold true, but they're very rare. Almost all of them are the full code for inventory and reorder purposes and so forth. Oh, another thing it does is it tells a mainframe computer everything you buy. So the beast knows what you're eating, what kind of things you use. But anyway, if you look at the code, the first set of bars and the last set of bars and the middle bars always have a number equivalent of 6. I had that verified by a computer expert. 666 is in every one of those codes. And now it's in your credit cards and bank cards, debit cards. And you can go to the store, you can go to Piggly Wiggly here, any of these supermarkets, buy your groceries, and they'll swipe your card through and it's paid. You know how close they are to putting that in somebody's hand and just whoosh, pass it across the scanner and it goes beep and it's paid. See, if you have this in everything, they'll know everything you eat, everything you read, everything you do. Now, the next verse here says, "And I saw one of his heads as it were wounded to death, and his deadly wound was healed, and all the world wondered after the beast." In other words, something should have happened to destroy this, but it didn't completely destroy it. It destroyed the power thereof. Now we know that when Jesus died for our salvation, what did he do? He wounded the head of Satan. Remember Genesis 3:16? 15, 16, that whole segment in there? "I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed." You've learned that, haven't you? Now, the next verse is the one I want to focus on here in our study. "And they worshipped the dragon which gave power unto the beast." Now, that's the power behind the beast, the dragon itself. "And they worshipped the beast, saying," notice the reaction of the world in the last days, "Who is like unto the beast? Who is able to make war with him?" A war to end all wars, a beast, a government rising up, a composite one that is so powerful that none would dare to make a war against him. That was their goal. It's called the United Nations. And then, of course, all of its clandestine, covert structure that you don't see. When we think of the United Nations, we think of that big building out there in New York with all the ambassadors and all of the consuls and all these different people that come there. But it's more than that. Something very, very clandestine and evil about it. Because it's the very institution of Satan. And it's looked at as being a great institution to end all wars. Who is like unto the beast? Who is able to make war with him? That was what they wanted the people to say. A great power rising up that none would dare stand against it. And that's what they're striving for. But in order to accomplish that, in a world that was divided as many nations, and of course there were nationalistic spirits and a lot of borders and a lot of disputes, there's only one way you can break a people down to finally get them to give in and have a one world government, and that's with a horrifying war. We had World War I. Remember, that produced something called a what? They wanted it to produce a conglomeration of nations. What did they call that? League of Nations. It didn't work. Why? Somebody had to join that wouldn't. The United States, of all nations, the United States balked. And why? The president certainly wanted it. Oh, by the way, there are great, great parallels, if you'll look for them, between Woodrow Wilson and Bill Clinton. Both of them won with a majority vote because the opposing party was divided. And both of them are trying to do similar things. I hope Clinton will go down in All they always say is the administration go down in flames, as if a plane crashing. I hope it does. But I hope Al Gore doesn't get in there. Then we've got some real trouble. Because he is what do I want to call him? He's a religious nut as far as environmentalism. He really is. And environmentalism as a religion is witchcraft. So anyway, Woodrow Wilson was president during World War I. He wanted the country in the League of Nations. It didn't go in. The Senate and House of Representatives, which collectively form the Congress of the United States, didn't want it. And they weren't sure if they wanted it, but there was a firebrand senator that stood up and violently spoke against this thing as an awful thing to be in. Remember his name? Henry Cabot Lodge. It was called the Lodge-controlled Senate at the time. I want to tell you one more thing that you have to understand in regard of, it's a little bit into political science, but I've got to tell you this or you'll never understand what's going on in your world today. Our government was set up so that you would have an executive branch, meaning the White House, the president, and his whole entourage. That was the voice of federalism, the White House. That was the federal voice. Then you had another voice, the voice of the people. That voice of the people was the House of Representatives. They were directly elected as representatives. But there was another voice. Can you think of what that other voice was? Now, we're not talking executive, legislative, and judicial now. Those are the three main branches of government. But I'm talking about the three voices in government. You have the voice of the White House, the voice of federalism, I should say. The voice of the people in general. What other voice? And the fact that nobody is sure shows what a good job they've done. The voice of the states. The way the government was set up, the people were to have a voice. The individual states of the Union were to have a voice. That's where your senators came in. Originally, the states would elect, the state legislatures would elect and or appoint, depending on circumstances, without the direct election of the people. The state would pick two men and send those two men to Washington. Like from Wisconsin, they would say, we are here on behalf of Wisconsin. That was the Senate. Or we are here on behalf of California, or Vermont, or Texas, or whatever the case may be. They were the state voice. And that's a powerful voice, isn't it? Then you had the voice of the people, and those were your representatives. And there would be a number of them. You always had two senators from every state. But representatives depended on population, the size of the state and the population. You understand what I'm saying? So some would have more representatives than others. And then, of course, you had the federal voice. So right now, our federal voice is whom? Bill Clinton. Our state voice is, if you're going to say Herb Kohl and Russ Feingold, you're wrong. The vocal cords of every state have been severed. I believe it was 1915 when they started the direct election of senators and forever silenced the state voice. Originally, the states picked senators. Now they're directly elected by the people. What's the problem with that? You can manipulate the people at large with the news media. If you have a liberal-controlled or communistic-controlled press and radio and television, you can manipulate the individual people to go and vote a certain way. And what happens is the states have no power to appoint anymore from within their legislative and governing bodies. So that has been severed. Now it's the voice of federalism and voice of the people. No state voice. That was one of the most heinous, destructive things that ever happened to our country. And none of the crazy things that used to be, that they always wanted to pass, None of those things ever passed until they had direct election of senators. Our Constitution says that the senators must be appointed by the state. But when they changed that, it actually is unconstitutional. But they changed it. I don't know what it would ever take to change it back. We won't ever see it. It's a very, very important point. And they never, ever, ever talk about it. After all, it sounds so democratic to have the people choose the senators, doesn't it? But then the state government has no power, no voice in Washington. Every state government is just a puppet government. See, before the Civil War, what was the Civil War fought in regard to, remember? What was it fought over? It wasn't slavery. States' rights. In other words, what was to keep the voice of federalism in line? What would be the great powers that would do that? The individual states. They had the powers. They had the militias. That's why the South seceded. That's why South Carolina said, we're pulling out. And in one state followed another, and they pulled down Old Glory, as they call it, and put up the stars and bars, and said, we are having our own country. States' rights. The states must have a voice. But all of that was killed, so that you've got one big country. Instead of having a United States of America, you'd have that only in name. The United States says many states united as one nation. There's only a shell of that now. At one time it truly was. There was autonomy, there was independence among these states, and they worked together. But that kept that federal government in line. That was the biggest fear of the founding fathers of this country, that there would be a central government that would get too big. Boy, it sure happened, didn't it? The abuse of power. Comments? Electoral votes? Okay, well, that's another subject, actually. I don't know how much time I've got to spend on that, but that is an important issue. The way a president is elected is really what are called electoral votes. And you have a popular vote, that's counting all the ballots of all the people. Then you have the electoral vote, which means that you have representatives from a state that cast a vote on behalf of what they figure most of the people want. Okay? And that's what really elects the president. Electoral votes. Votes by delegates that are sent by the people, supposedly. I don't know if you can smell a rat there, but I can. Was there ever a president that had more popular votes but still, than the opponent, but still lost? Remember who it was? Who had more popular votes? Did I hear somebody say Nixon? Richard Milhouse Nixon had more popular votes than Kennedy, but he lost. Kennedy had more electoral votes. So how could the majority of the people want Nixon and get Kennedy instead when Nixon had more votes? Isn't this a wonderful government we have? Anyway, we'll get into this now. I'll turn the overhead on. We'll go back to World War II and look at how some of these things took place. Just a very, very quick review. We got to get from Europe over to the Pacific real quickly here. Remember this guy's name here standing up in the front of that vehicle? Yes, Adolf Hitler. And there he is with one of his generals. We talked about this last time. He was just taking over the country at this time. Okay? Now you got to understand something. Just notice their faces again. I asked you to do this last week. Look at the emptiness in their eyes. Have you ever seen such a thing? I honestly believe, and I have no way of proving this, this is simply conjecture on my part, but if you look at the Bible, there you will find examples of Satan literally dwelling in a certain place and in a certain person, like the king of Persia. Well, I honestly think that this guy right here, Adolf Hitler, had the devil himself living inside of him for a while. I really do. I can't prove it, but the more I study about him, the more I realize it would have to be. He literally devastated the world. Now, here's the map I wanted up here. It's called the European Theater. As I mentioned at one point, we don't have wars, we have theaters of wars. They're put together. But this was a very devastating thing. All of Europe was engulfed in war. We talked about how Hitler rose into power and began to weld the German people behind him. And then he began to claim land. Any place there were people who spoke German, he said that was Germany's land. Well, that's interesting, isn't that? It's quite a concept. He began to talk about how the German people were blonde, blue-eyed supermen, master race. They were destined to rule the world, to bring new, you know what he said? You know what Hitler's favorite terminology was? New world order. We will bring the world to order. We will put mankind in its place. And when he made his speeches, he would hold his clenched fists and talk with his hands, and the people went into a frenzy. They caught the spirit. What is that? Is that Pepsi-Cola or Coke or one of those that says catch the spirit? They got that? Yeah. Pepsi, catch the spirit. Incidentally, you ever look at a Pepsi can and see the logo on there? It's circled with that sine curve going through it. That's the zodiac of astrology. It's also a takeoff on the yin-yang symbol. But more so, it is that sine, theta, cosine, if you know your trigonometry, it's that sine curve that cuts through, which is an emblem of astrology. You'll also notice that in Coca-Cola, they got the same wave in there. Catch the wave, catch the spirit. But anyway, Hitler claimed he claimed he was the master race, and he was going to have a new world order. And if you recall, it was George Bush who began to say the same thing in this country. A new world order. Now they're saying it all the time. That that's what they want to have. This was all leading up to it. Now Hitler, we talked about how he demanded that the Danzig corridor, which was a little area between, right here, see this little corridor of land here by Danzig? Here's Prussia. That is part of Germany. But see, this little piece of Poland comes up and separates the main country of Germany from East Prussia, or as the Germans call it, Preußen. That is German. Well, Hitler said that piece of land is ours. We don't have a divided Germany. So he said, I want it. Furthermore, he said, I want the Sudetenland down by Czechoslovakia. He wanted the Alsace-Lorraine over near France. He wanted the Saar region. And this was not his land. This was not German territory. But he said, I want it. And he proceeded to take it. He just plain moved in, his stormtroopers, as they were called, and crushed everything. He sent his dive bombers in his Messerschmitts, and Messerschmitts were dive bomber planes. You can always tell they have like a long glass cowl on them. I'm sure you've seen pictures of them. And he had various types of bombers and fighters, and he went in and just devastated everything. The man had no conscience at all. So he was horrifying the world. What he wanted to do is come in and take all of Europe, eventually Britain, but he started his major campaign with Poland. He was given, in other words, the British sent Neville Chamberlain over. Neville Chamberlain said, well, we will arrange for you to have the Sudetenland here in Czechoslovakia. And that was just given to him without any fight. Austria, he just came marching in and took it, no resistance. Then Poland, of course, was not going to give in. So that's where he started his blitzkrieg. He sent his stormtroopers into Poland. He sent his tanks, his dive bombers, and so forth, and they hit Poland hard. And they took the country. Now Stalin also moved in, and Stalin had a non-aggression pact with Hitler. They weren't going to ever fight each other. Of course, any agreement with Hitler was not worth the paper it was written on. But they took Poland. Now Mussolini, the dictator in Italy, thought, well, boy, I'd like to take something. You know? These guys are like a bunch of kids with some very powerful toys. So what did Mussolini do? Well, he moved in to Ethiopia. Went in and just killed and crushed and destroyed everything. These people had nothing. They were throwing spears and they had primitive weapons. So he went in and took Ethiopia. Hitler then set his sights on the northern states. Now, the first thing he did is he put a fifth column. You know what a fifth column is? Okay? Yeah, you might call them spies. They're infiltrators. They come in and they gain popularity among people, gain some respect, do things, but actually they're working for an enemy government. And they get in among you and they stir up people and win the sympathies of people over. And then you've got a weak spot in that country, which is beginning to spread. It's like decay in a tooth. Okay? And it starts to weaken everything. And this is what he did. He began to put them in the northern states. He had them in Belgium. He had them in a lot of them in France. He had them in the Netherlands and in Denmark. His goal was he had to take Britain. He wanted to do what Napoleon could not do. He wanted to take Britain because he believed if he could take all of Europe and take Britain, from there he could attack the United States from the east, and the Japanese would attack from the west and move in and take over the United States. And of course then he would have the whole world. It's kind of interesting. I said these were like a bunch of kids with powerful toys. It was Hermann Goering who said, "We own the world and space." I mean, that's quite a lofty claim, isn't it? It's one thing to say we own the world. I mean, that's lofty. But space? I think he has some space for rent. But so here you have Germany expanding out. He said, in order to get England, I've got to go to the north. I have to take these northern states. So what did he do? He got up and made speeches and put these on the radio and broadcast this. He said, we have never had any quarrel with the northern states, and we do not now. Meaning the Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Belgium, northern states primarily anything north of Germany. While he was making the speeches, he was already planning his attacks. Now, he wanted France. That was a real prize. But he had a problem, because after World War I, France built a powerful fortification starting at the border of Belgium and moving along the border of France and Germany, called the Maginot Line. Now that's spelled, the French is a little bit unusual as a language. I believe it's Maginot, but pronounced Maginot. Maginot Line was named after a General Maginot, and what it was is it was underground bunkers, very high tech for the time, heavily fortified. It could not be taken. Germany knew they couldn't take that Maginot Line. They couldn't get past it. And it was all along the border of France, from Belgium all the way down there, separating Germany from France. How were they going to take France? Now, here's what they did. They played quite a crafty game, actually. They took Belgium. They took Denmark. They took the Netherlands, and they took Norway first. Then they moved into France. Now, the first target was Norway. Now, they sailed. Norway has a lot of little fjords. You know what a fjord is? As you go along the whole edge of Norway here, there are little inlets into the mountains. And you can hide ships in there, warships. And he wanted to take that. Now, Norway was fortified. They had a lot of fortifications, and Hitler knew it would be difficult. But he had an ace card up his sleeve. There was a man You're going to recognize his, Brother Mick's going to recognize his name right away. I think Sister Pat will too. A man named Vidkun Quisling, Major Vidkun Quisling, who was in charge of the fjord fortification all the way along the border of Norway with the sea. So that would be their western border. Hitler's ship sailed in, and Vidkun Quisling gave the orders to not defend, to not shoot. He literally handed the country of Norway over to the Third Reich. And they came in, and there wasn't a whole lot of resistance. There was a little. But he quickly crushed it with his dive bombers and with his infantry, and always with their Panzer division, their tanks. They had a very superior, well-built tank, and they crushed everything. So they took Norway. Now, they also took Denmark at almost the same time. These nations were falling fast. Now, that was in the month of April that they took Norway. It was also Denmark. Notice April 9th. Norway and Denmark both fell the same day. The Netherlands, Hitler got up and made another speech how he had no quarrel with the Netherlands and intended no problem with the Netherlands at all. While he was making a speech, he was already mobilizing against them. So what he did is he moved in and just literally started taking over the country. Sure.
The Netherlands is no quick one.
Sure, it's a huge city. And what they did is they did target Rotterdam in the Netherlands. And the way they did it, when they started moving in, they told the officials in Rotterdam, if you will, now we're poised and we're ready to take over. Now, if you will surrender Rotterdam to us, we'll leave it alone. We'll just come in peacefully. And being faced with the loss of possible many innocent lives, the government said okay. And they surrendered Rotterdam. But right after the papers were signed, they came in and destroyed it anyway. And leveled. I mean, their word was no good at all. They said, we're going to come in, we're going to occupy, we're going to use your country, we won't bother you. After the papers were signed, they flattened Rotterdam. Now, there was a resistance movement, but not nearly, I mean, it was impossible. With a mechanized force the size of Hitler's, and with the equipment that he had, resistance was in vain. And he plundered and destroyed and purposely bombed hospitals, churches, things like that, just to demoralize people, just to scare them and shake them up so badly that they'd be so horrified they wouldn't try to have any resistance. Another trick they used is they would use their planes, their dive bombers and fighter planes, to come in on refugees who were leaving the cities. They wouldn't kill the refugees, but they would herd them together on the roads where Allied forces had gathered to try to come against the Third Reich. Those roads would be clogged. The planes would herd all these refugees into these roads. They're trying to escape, and it would block and clog the roads so that the Allied forces couldn't get through. So they had quite a system planned. So the Netherlands was overrun, and then in this forest area near Belgium, just north of the Maginot Line, the Third Reich, with its bombers, it heavily used their bombers, came through into France, and of course France set all of their divisions up along here in this area, but Germany came through and forced the French army not to surrender necessarily, but they literally ran away. General Charles de Gaulle, with what was left of the army after the Germans pounded it and pounded it and pounded it, the French did put up quite a fight. Charles de Gaulle took his army and went to Africa. So he took everything, all of Europe, this whole area, now England. He had to get England. So he started the Battle of Britain. Oh, by the way, British forces were in France helping the French, but they were driven back, and they ended up in a little city, let's see if I can see it on here, Dunkirk. Okay, well, it's about in here somewhere. The British sent everything that would float, everything, moved it across the channel, and they rescued most of their army at Dunkirk. They were backed up against the ocean, but they were rescued, and the army was taken back to England where they would be able to fight again. So now Hitler had all of Europe. Now he was going to move across and take it. And what he did is he used his bombers again. Sending his bombers over, he began to pound England. He stood on the shores of France and looked at the white cliffs of Dover, and he said, "That's my country. I'm going to take it. I'm going to do what no one else has ever done." But the British had the Royal Air Force. They had quite a navy as well. But the Navy wasn't a big defense and wouldn't dare try to stop the massive amounts of planes that were coming over. The Navy couldn't handle that. The dive bombers were coming in on the ships in the channel and sinking them. But the Royal Air Force began to defend against the Luftwaffe. Luftwaffe was the German Air Force. And there were many air battles that were fought, and England made a major dent in the Third Reich. They shot down hundreds of the German planes. And Hitler got so mad because the Royal Air Force was shooting down so many of his planes that he decided to send bombers at night. And what he did is, one of the cities he did this to was Coventry. He went in and leveled the city of Coventry. He just wiped it, just like Rotterdam. There's nothing left. And of course, the people, they had the air raid sirens, and people would run for their shelters, and it was quite a time to be living. People worked as much as 20 hours a day in the factories to rebuild planes, to rebuild everything they could. Here was little England trying to defend against what was now not only Germany, but Hitler had 100 million slaves in all these countries working in their factories, doing all these things. They either had to work for him or starve. So he was pulling the resources of all the conquered countries. People wondered, how could little Germany do all this? He was pulling in all the resources from all of Europe. And England kept fighting back, and finally Hitler had to stop his attack. He never took England. He bombed London and other areas in England, all along the coast, trying to knock out the Air Force. But the British never kept their planes together. They always kept them out. They'd take them out in the woods, or they'd hide them. They weren't put on airstrips so they could be bombed out. So he never took England. Now he was really mad. So he decided to go the other way. He went toward Russia and started what he called the Wehrmacht. When he attacked Russia, he was also beaten back by the Russian winter and the vast amount of land. Russia is a country that's never really been beaten because you have to go so far to get to Moscow. It's a huge country. But he invaded them on June 22nd, 1941, but he didn't stay. There was the Battle of Stalingrad that was fought, and he had to go back. So now he was in trouble. He was locked into just the European area, and the whole course of the war began to change. The next big event, and of course I have to skip over a lot of things, I realize that. But Normandy was invaded on June 6, 1944, and that was called what now? The Normandy invasion? D-Day. The Allied forces landed, the French army came back to help, and everybody started moving across France. Now the Allied forces were moving toward Germany. And eventually, Patton, who had been down fighting Rommel in the Panzer Division in northern Africa, in Tunisia and so forth, along in this area, was transferred over into Europe, and he and General Montgomery of England began to march across France and eventually into Germany. And toward the end of the war, Russia also moved in, and then later they divided up all the conquered territory. But we have one more phase to cover, and that's what I really wanted to get at. We talked about bombers. Air power was a major factor in the war. These bombs were called blockbusters because they could take out, one bomb could take out a whole city block, just level everything. Oh, I heard that they bombed the rest of the building in Oklahoma City, and they knew just how to do it. They did one charge and it dropped the rest of the building, for cleanup purposes. So I think I know who did it initially. But anyway, we mentioned the attack on Pearl Harbor. I won't spend a lot of time on that because I did that before. But the Japanese sent 33 large ships. I believe there were 8 aircraft carriers, and the rest were destroyers and destroyer escorts and so forth that came in toward Pearl Harbor, and then 360 planes were sent against Pearl Harbor in what was called a sneak attack. I had mentioned how Roosevelt knew that in advance, but Roosevelt wanted to use this incident to get the people so angry in this country that they would willingly propel the country into World War II rather. Okay? The way you can remember how many ships and planes Japan sent is very easy. 33 is the big number of the Freemasons, and 360 is the number of the degrees in the circle, which is also sacred to Freemasonry, and the religion of the Illuminati itself. Anyway, Pearl Harbor was attacked, devastated. United States ships were sunk, and the people in the nation were so angry they were ready to demand war. But Roosevelt, the president, did that for them, basically. He stood up and said December 8th is the day that the war was actually declared against Germany and Japan. And remember the famous speech, December 7th, 1941, a day which will live on in infamy, and so forth. He got the people to want to enter the war. Okay? So here's the Pacific Theater, basically consisting of, you have Australia down here, okay? You have the Philippines in this area, French Indochina here, Hong Kong, Manila in here in the Philippines, Mariana Islands, Midway, Guam, and Wake Islands. Hawaii is over here. You get Pearl Harbor happening. Midway is up there. And Japan, a lot of people don't realize this, but they went way up to the Aleutian Islands just off from Alaska. You see, they had planned to invade the United States by way of Alaska, to come down toward Washington that way, the state of Washington. But you have a massive amount of water. This was a war fought in the Pacific Ocean. Okay? Any comments so far? Do you understand what's going on here? Now, the head of the Army, the head of the Navy in Japan was Admiral Yamamoto. Admiral Yamamoto had the most powerful navy, most fortified navy in the world, even greater than that of Great Britain for a while, because Japan was preparing for war. Hirohito, the emperor, was looked at as God, and the Japanese people were willing to die for their god, Hirohito. In fact, if they were captured, they would many times kill themselves. They would commit what was called hara-kiri. They'd pull out their big knife and just ram it into themselves rather than be taken. Another thing, all the Japanese carried a little tiny metal box around their neck with 2 cyanide pills. And if they were going to be taken, they'd quickly pop those pills in their mouth and scoop a little water out of the sea or somewhere and just throw it in their mouth and swallow it and die. Because they believed then that they would go to their great reward because they were dying for their god, Emperor Hirohito. In fact, some of them were willing to give their entire life if they could just get a glimpse of this man. That's how, you just want to show you the mentality of the people that were fighting. They would get in planes that were referred to as kamikaze planes because they would dive, they'd load their plane full of high explosives and dive into the enemy ships and blow them up that way. And it's pretty hard to fight against somebody who's willing to do that. All you can do is hope you can hit them in the air before they hit your ship. So you have to understand there was a lot of religion, a lot of devils at work, a lot of things going on in this war. The devils were just having a delightful time with all the bloodshed and carnage and problems. In addition to that, the Japanese, and a lot of people don't hear this in the textbooks either, the Japanese took Korea, the nation of Korea. Let's see if it has a date here for that. We know they went in and took Manchuria in 1931. That was well before the war started. But Korea, let's see. Okay, they don't show the date it was taken. But they took the country of Korea primarily to not only possess the land, they weren't that interested in it, but they took the Korean women to force them to serve as prostitutes for the Japanese soldiers, which is just an awful thing. And they hauled them off and they sent them all over to the islands where the Japanese soldiers were. So that's what they wanted Korea for. Now, many battles, too many to talk about, really, were fought in all of these little islands. One of the famous ones was Iwo Jima, because if you've ever seen that picture, a famous picture of the flag being raised there, the four men that were pushing the flag up after a terrible, terrible battle. One of the men in that picture was from Antigo, Wisconsin. He was the last man, the man who was reaching for the flag, and his hands weren't quite on it. But there were four men planting it in the ground after they beat the Japanese. So the Japanese fought with a powerful navy. Admiral Yamamoto had a vast navy and aircraft carriers, and he had the most sophisticated airplane in the world at the time. It was a Mitsubishi A6M Japanese Zero. It was unsurpassed in its fighting ability, maneuverability. The weapons, by the way, on that were built by the British factories in Japan, which were taken over by the Japanese government, the Vickers Machine Gun Company. See, a lot of different nations were in Japan using their labor force, and the Japanese just basically took the factories and used them. Now, you can see why, but that's what they did. So the war continued on. We had a general, a famous general who fought in the Pacific. His name starts with an M. You think of what his name was? General Douglas MacArthur, man with the corncob pipe. I shall return. And his dad was Arthur MacArthur. Did you know that? From Wisconsin? Okay. Truman didn't like him. We'll get into that later. Truman fired him, actually, during the Korean War. So, what happened here is this massive war was fought, and the Japanese were hard to knock out because they were holding all these little islands, and we were spread so thin. But we land on an island and just fight and fight and fight until, it was taken. And a lot of terrible things happened. And finally, Truman said the only way we're ever going to win this war and end it is they could hold these islands indefinitely. In fact, 10 to 15 years later, they still found Japanese soldiers in some of these islands, little islands, trying to hold them. They thought, we'll never be able to win this war unless we terrify Japan and force them to surrender. So what he did is he arranged for the atomic bomb to be dropped on Hiroshima and another one on Nagasaki. They were bombed with such devastation in fact, here it is. The atomic bomb being dropped on Hiroshima. The mushroom cloud, the devastation, the high heat. When you drop an atomic bomb, when you detonate one, what happens is there's a reaction, there's a brilliant flash of light. And then there is a devastating roar and a high radioactive wind. And it just, the shaking of it, the explosion of it, just destroys, and the heat, the intense heat and the light. Everything within 30 miles of the epicenter of this thing is gone. And so they literally wiped out 2 cities. Then Japan surrendered. But before they surrendered, before the surrender was accepted, planes came in with incendiary bombs and burned 90% of the entire country. Buildings made of wood. Very few buildings had any metal in them at all. They're all wood structures. And they literally leveled the entire country of Japan. And of course that allowed the bankers to come in and rebuild it and claim control of it. As I said, when the military generals moved out, then the real generals moved in. General Electric, General Dynamics, etc., etc. Okay? So, it was a horrifying thing. A lot of people hated Truman. They said he'd burn in hell for dropping that bomb on all those innocent people. But he said, well, it's either that or the war will drag on and a lot more people will die. It was a no-win situation as far as lives were concerned. That's the horror of war. They had painted themselves into a corner. They had put themselves in a situation where you had to kill a lot of people either way. That's sin in action. Now, my words probably don't paint the picture very well. You would really have to see some of this, some of these newsreels and so forth. I do have the collection, except for 2 tapes, of actual, none of it's Hollywood, it's actual films taken of when it really happened. And a lot of the clippings in there, it's put together very nicely, are actually from captured films from Germany, from Japan. And if you want to see those, you're welcome to see them. I'm going to arrange for that. But anyway, the bomb, the atomic bomb, the force of that thing basically ended the war. And Japan finally surrendered. Now, with the surrender came other problems. How do we divide up the world? Here's a very famous picture. Now, I know some of you studied a little history. Do you know who this man is? Sir Winston Churchill. He was quite a plucky old guy. And he was an Illuminist. He belonged to the League of Just Men, which is an Illuminati organization. How about this man in the middle? Roosevelt. Franklin Delano Roosevelt. How about this man right over here? Joseph Stalin. Now, Joseph Stalin was quite a character. He, before he came into power in Russia, he was a train robber in the Russian mountains. He was just a crook, just a bandit. And of course, he put to death millions of people that resisted him when he took over the country. So actually, every one of those men you're looking at are mass murderers in the truest sense of the word. In fact, Roosevelt, well, I won't go into all of it, but some of the decisions he made, and then later Truman and Eisenhower. Actually, Dwight D. Eisenhower gave the go-ahead for what was called Operation Keelhaul. And what that was is a lot of the Russian army had defected from Stalin and from communism. And they were in Europe. And Eisenhower was told by Stalin, if you send them back to Russia, I will have them executed. Eisenhower, knowing they would be executed, forced them back to Russia, where every one of them were machine gunned. Tens of thousands of these men were machine gunned because of what Eisenhower did. So there are a lot of things that people had done that we don't hear much about. And I guess I wouldn't want to be in any of their positions. When you get into a situation like that, just terrible things happen on every hand. But these three men were here at a place called Yalta, which was a resort on the Black Sea. And there it was determined how the world would be divided up. Stalin was literally given all of Eastern Europe and part of Germany. And of course, Churchill was given areas. England, of course, occupied part of Germany. And they made plans for the future at Yalta. Okay, that picture is a very famous picture where they divided up the whole world. Now what would happen? It was 1945. Germany surrendered. Japan surrendered. The war was over. But now the world was realigned. The next big event that happened is what they wanted to happen after World War I. A man named Alger Hiss, along with his accomplices Dalton Trumbo, Harry Dexter White, whose real name was Weiss, Jewish man, Litvinov, Kaganovich, Russians, and several others, put together the United Nations Treaty. It was drafted in San Francisco, California. They flew it to Washington. They presented it to the Congress. First of all, to the Senate, where it was immediately approved. The only two senators that voted against the UN treaty and charter were the two that read it. The rest voted for it, never bothering so much as to read the documents. Furthermore, they were copied word for word from the Soviet Union's constitution. Word for word. In the charter, it was stated that in the military secretariat, in other words, the military arm of the UN to ensure peace, that the head of the military secretariat must always be a Russian. Always a Russian. They had what was called a UN Security Council, a core of nations. And then they had member nations. The original charter nations were fixed. They could not be removed. Russia, of course, was one of them. Now, the United Nations, the land for it was donated by John D. Rockefeller's, actually his estate, the Rockefeller fortune, donated the land for the UN building in New York City. And they determined that they were going to rule the world. But there were some things going on in the United Nations. As I said, Russia always had control of the military, and our government approved it, except for the two senators that read it. Furthermore, it cost a lot of money to run an organization like this, to build this massive building, and all of the debt, all of the cost, with the exception of a small fraction, was paid by the United States. In fact, Russia has always refused to pay her share. Russia has never paid anything in the UN effort, and yet has always had control of the military. Still does. A lot of people don't know that, don't realize it. There was another war that broke out after World War II. Well, let me ask if there's any questions or comments at this point. I'm having to move along rather quickly. Shirley? No, everything was over when they were at Yalta. Yeah, Truman, right. But the war was basically, here's why I say that. There was still shooting and fighting going on. But Japan officially tried to surrender before Truman actually took over. They sent an unconditional surrender. So it was over and it wasn't over. People were still shooting. It was still going on. They hadn't officially surrendered. Well, they did officially surrender. I don't know how to teach this any other way. If you look at the surrender that we think is the surrender, there was one before that by like 9 months. And they sent the documents to the embassy in the Soviet Union, to the War Department in the United States, to the Congress of the United States, and later on, when Truman was asked why Roosevelt didn't accept the surrender from Japan, he said, there was nobody here that could read it. We didn't know what it meant. It was written in Japanese. You mean there was nobody in this country who could read Japanese? Now understand, that was before the atomic bombs were dropped. So what I'm trying to say, I don't want to confuse you. No, the war, they were gathered in February 1945. February 4th, it'll tell you right there. But Japan had already tried, or was in process of trying to surrender. That's why I said it was all over. But it continued on because the bulldozers, meaning the airplanes, the bombers, hadn't finished their job yet. Yeah, right. The official surrender was later, yeah. But the surrender was, see, it's confusing, isn't it? The surrender was, they tried to make it earlier. Yeah, yep, because FDR died in April. He didn't live long. Yeah, he didn't live long after this. 2 months. And the reason they killed him, remember they blew the top of his head off, massive cerebral hemorrhage, is because Stalin had microfilm and recordings made of this whole thing. And he was going to use it as a club over Roosevelt's head to get even more land. They were afraid Roosevelt, under pressure, was going to spill the beans, and so they killed him. All right? But that was the famous picture there. Now, I hope you can understand the sequence on this thing. Japan tried to surrender. Really, the war would have been over at this point. Technically, it was. But not officially. Okay? Now, after the war was over, after the UN Charter was signed, everything was in place, another war broke out in Little Korea. This involved, by the way, communism had spread not only filled Russia, but also into China. And Chiang Kai-shek was driven out of China to a little island called Formosa, which is off the coast of China, and there he had a large army and had planned to reinvade because Mao Zedong had taken over China and brought in communism with him, a very radical form of communism. Red China, it became known as. You see, one of the purposes of World War II was to build up communism in the world, to make it real big and use it as a threat to control the people of the world by fear until it was no longer needed. And you'll notice how that was, if you remember back to the 60s, I'm sure, Pat and Mick, I'm sure you remember, they dropped that bomb on us every day. We used to have these tests. For a while they called, dial 640 or 1240 on your radio, and this is a test. And civil defense was real big, and they had fallout shelters everywhere. Every community had fallout shelters. We had to crawl under our desks and put our hands over our heads as practice. And I helped to set up a fallout shelter with the Geiger counters and how to defend against, because the Russians were going to come and get us. We were told that in school. The Russians were going to come and get us. A man named Nikita Khrushchev had come into power. I'll show you his picture. There you see him with his good buddy, Nelson Rockefeller. In fact, I'll start with this one next time because I want to explain some things on that. But let me just tell you a little bit about the Korean War first. The Korean War was fought because Communist China was backing an element in Korea, Northern Korea, to bring communism into that country. Now, in order to stop the spread of communism, Korea, of course, appealed to the United Nations saying, look, the communists are coming in. China's coming in and taking our country. China was not a member of the United Nations. They wouldn't let them in. That was to infuriate them, to incite the war. So China was coming into Korea, and the United Nations was called on to defend. Well, the United States sent Douglas MacArthur over. MacArthur had a plan to completely beat the North Korean and Chinese army. And it would have worked. In fact, but let me tell you how this happened. During this time, the head of the military secretariat of the UN was a Russian general, Alexander Vasilyev. Vasilyev took a leave of absence from the UN to head and advise the North Korean army, which was fighting against the UN. Huh? How you like them apples? The head of the military secretariat of the UN takes a leave of absence to head the enemy forces against the UN. And every plan that MacArthur, every battle plan that he had to be first submitted to the UN and forwarded to his enemy commander, Vasilyev, for approval. Huh? But he was still beating him. He was still winning. And he had a plan to cut off the supply line, and he was going to go in, and he was going to move right into China and wipe out communism in China. And Chiang Kai-shek was ready to come in from Formosa. And just as he was about to execute his plan, which would have worked, it was all locked in for certain. I mean, the supply line would have been cut. They could not supply Korea. See, Korea is a little nation that juts out to the south. China is a vast expanse with a lot of mountains, very rough to transport things. He was going to cut the supply line and then move in and take over. And it would have worked. He had a massive army with Chiang Kai-shek in Formosa that would have come across and helped him. Truman fired him because he was doing too well. He was going to destroy communism. So Truman fired him. Truman, one of the biggest liars that ever, except Bill Clinton's beaten him out, I think. But Harry Truman was the man who was thought of as being so brave because at one point he walked into a Ku Klux Klan meeting. They had a massive meeting set up. And I checked out some records from the library and listened to Truman talk for 3 hours telling his stories, you know. But he walked into the Ku Klux Klan meeting with a burning cross outside and all these wizards in there, you know, the hoods and all this stuff. And they were all armed and angry and nasty. Truman dismissed his Secret Service agents, told them to stay where they were, and he personally walked up to the Grand Imperial Wizard and dismissed him and told him to call it off and go home. Well, of course, you got to understand, Harry S. Truman was the 33rd degree Mason in the Scottish Rite. And so he was just talking to another Mason because the Ku Klux Klan is a division of Freemasonry. Of course, when he was taken to task for that, a news commentator asked him about the Masonic Lodge and his membership there because they said, this newsman said, I don't recall his name right now, but he said, a lot of people are a little bit apprehensive about you because you're a Freemason. a 33rd degree Mason, and it's a secret society. Do you know what Truman said? Are you ready for this answer? Truman said, yes, I am a 33rd degree Mason, but as far as it being a secret society, he said, I'll be damned if I know any secrets. Where do you think he is? I think that's a pretty good guess, Stephen. Because if you're a member of the Freemasons, you know some secrets. I guarantee you that right now, especially the level he was in. But what a thing to say. I'll be damned if I know any secrets. That's terrible. Wow. Anyway. So, how did the Korean War end? Well, they decided to call a truce. They drew a line that was called the 38th parallel. I don't have a good map to show you on this. I could try to get one, I suppose, but 38th parallel. Okay, Korea is this little country right here. 38th parallel cuts right across. And so we have North Korea, South Korea. It's still that way. And they basically just ended the war. They fought and they fought and they fought and they fought and killed and butchered and then said, okay, we'll call it quits and draw a line. It's called the No-Win War, a brand new concept, a war that cannot be won by either side, but must be fought. So you can devastate the country. It's urban renewal project. Wipe out the old, send the bankers in, the Occidentals, meaning the Westerners, send them in, they'll rebuild it, they'll own it. Urban renew the world and control it from London and New York. That's what happened. Who controls Japan? It's controlled from London and New York via the banking system. Who controls Germany? Same people. It's the whole world system. Okay? Final questions here? Communism. Well, no, they wanted to take over Korea. Korea was an area that they wanted for urban renewal, to come in and take over the industry, build industry there, and basically gather that workforce. How many products do you see made in Korea? Made in Japan? Made in China? Formosa. China generally meant Taiwan. Hong Kong. British controlled. Singapore. See, they basically controlled. I will, next week when I talk about the moving through the 50s and into the 60s and up to the present, because I'm going to end here. But I want to talk to you a little bit about the Vietnam War, the protests, the music revolution, the civil unrest, and all of these things. And we'll move right on up to our present day. I'm going to try and pack a lot of stuff in there. I hope there's a lot of information I was trying to get out to you, and I hope this wasn't confusing at all. I was a little concerned about the one point there with the surrender, because you understand what I was saying. Yes, it was really over, but the bombs were still dropping, and the papers weren't signed. Well, you know, they had to finish the bulldozer job, and they couldn't be dropping bombs if the papers were signed. So they just refused to sign the papers for 9 months. Okay?